to The Catholic Perspective, a podcast brought to you by rcspirituality.org. Enjoy the episode.
Some straight talk about Pius XII and the Holocaust.
Pope Pius XII, whose Christian name was Eugenio Pacelli, and whose papacy spanned the years of World War II, has been repeatedly accused of directly or indirectly aiding the Nazi effort to exterminate the Jews, an effort referred to as the Holocaust or the Shoah. If it's true that a pope supported or encouraged, approved of, or even failed to come out against such a horrific episode of world history, it would do a lot to discredit the moral authority of the Catholic Church. And many people, Catholics and non-Catholics, are eager to do just that, because the moral authority of the Catholic Church is a constant antagonist of a lot of very pleasant, very convenient, very profitable, and very immoral activities. So what's the story? Was the leader of the Catholic Church during World War II partly responsible for the massacre of over 6 million Jews, and another 6 million non-Jews, by the way, at the hands of Nazi criminals? Was the Pope really a Nazi collaborationist? Or an irresponsible simpleton? Or a reprehensible coward? It's worth looking at the accusations and the evidence to find out. Before doing so, however, we should take a quick look at the Church's official position towards Nazism before the start of World War II. Some critics say that the Catholic Church condoned Nazism because the Vatican made a concordat, a diplomatic agreement, with Nazi Germany in 1933, the very year Hitler came to power. In actual fact, the Concordat indicated just the opposite, that the Church was leery of Germany's political stance towards Catholics and wanted to protect itself. The Concordat granted freedom of education and religious practice to Catholics, something that the Church had been working towards even before Hitler was elected. Then, when Hitler's government failed to execute the terms of the agreement and initiated a new persecution of the Catholic Church in Germany, the Vatican made repeated complaints and efforts to reinstate the Concordat, all of which were rebuffed, until Pope Pius XI was induced to publish the encyclical Mit brennender Sorge, admonishing all Catholics in Germany not to succumb to Nazi propaganda, and listing the Nazis' violations of the Concordat, reasserting Catholicism's Jewish roots, denouncing racism and discrimination of every kind, and delineating one by one the errors of Nazi ideology. The encyclical was so blatantly anti-Nazi that it had to be smuggled into the country. Some priests even hid it in their tabernacles until it was made public on Palm Sunday in 1937, when it was read simultaneously from every Catholic pulpit in the country. It clarified, for all Catholics, the Church's anti-Nazi position. But it also made Hitler and his regime furious. They redoubled their persecution and slander campaigns. Eugenio Pacelli, the future Pope Pius XII, was the one who drafted that encyclical. At the time, he was serving as Vatican Secretary of State, and in 1939, when he became Pope, he chose the name Pius XII, making it clear to everyone that he was determined to continue that same anti-Nazi policy, which he did. So the official position of the Catholic Church was anti-Nazi, not anti-Semitic. If some individual Catholics dissented and jumped on the Nazi bandwagon, they were doing it of their own accord, in direct contradiction of Church teaching. But critics say that this official position was just a smokescreen, that behind it, the Pope supported Hitler's cause, and he showed that support by a conspicuous silence regarding the Holocaust during the war. What motives do these critics give to the Pope's supposed silence? Some say he was personally anti-Semitic, but most say he was afraid of what the Nazis would do to the Church if he spoke and acted out, or that he was more afraid of communism's victory than he was of Hitler and Nazism, and so he was willing to tolerate the Nazis' extermination of the Jews in hopes that Hitler would eventually crush communism. Thus, they accuse the Pope, and therefore they hope the whole Catholic hierarchy, of a cowardly and guilty silence. Pius XII, they say, you should have and could have done more to end the Holocaust, and you didn't, because you were afraid of what Hitler would do to you and the Church if you did. You let your personal and selfish interests obstruct your moral obligations. Shame on you. But what exactly did Pope Pius XII do in the face of the Nazi final solution? And what could he have done that he didn't do? It is true that during the war he did not take advantage of every opportunity to speak out explicitly against Nazism, even though a lot of people wanted him to. He himself admitted this. It was a conscious, tactical choice, according to the historical record anyway, which some critics will, for reasons of their own, continue to ignore or deprecate. The tactic was simple. If he guarded his words, speaking out, yes, but not rashly, not indiscriminately, then the Catholic Church would still be able to function, more or less, in Germany and in the occupied territories, and so Catholics would be able to continue helping Jews and other persecuted groups escape from Nazi terror. If he spoke out too explicitly or too frequently against Nazi atrocities, Hitler would have an excuse to intensify his violence and hinder Catholic rescue operations, as he did in Nazi-occupied Holland, for instance. When the Catholic bishops in Holland vehemently and explicitly denounced Nazism, the Nazi authorities responded by deporting and exterminating not only practicing Jews, but also Jews who were married to Catholics, they had been exempt before, and even Jewish converts to Catholicism who had also been exempt. St. Edith Stein was one of these. By guarding his tongue, then, Pius XII hoped to avoid these kind of retaliatory measures, and at the same time give his bishops, priests, religious, and lay people more freedom of action, so that they could continue organizing underground railroads and places of refuge for Jews and other Nazi victims, which he repeatedly instructed all bishops to do, and which he himself did when the Nazis occupied Rome. Even so, this silence was too loud for Hitler and his cronies. Heinrich Himmler, for instance, the head of the dreaded SS, warned that, quote, "We should not forget that in the long run, the Pope in Rome is a greater enemy of National Socialism than Churchill or Roosevelt," end quote. After occupying Rome, the Germans concocted a plan to, quote, "massacre Pius XII with the entire Vatican because of the papal protest in favor of the Jews," end quote. This so-called silence was also loud enough to win for Pius XII the unequivocal accolades of the New York Times at the darkest hour of the war. On Christmas Day in 1941, Pius XII addressed the world in a Vatican radio broadcast, in which he condemned all the injustice and falseness not only of Nazism, but also of the false philosophies that had given birth to it. He mentioned no country or people by name, and yet his message was loud and clear, such that the New York Times reported on it by saying, quote, "The voice of Pius XII is a lonely voice in the silence and darkness enveloping Europe this Christmas. In calling for a real new order based on liberty, justice, and love, the Pope put himself squarely against Hitlerism. Pius XII left no doubt that the Nazi aims are also irreconcilable with his own conception of a Christian peace," end quote. And in 1942, the London Times offered similar praise for this lonely voice. Quote, "A study of the words which Pope Pius XII has addressed since his accession leaves no room for doubt. He condemns the worship of force and its concrete manifestations in the suppression of national liberties and in the persecution of the Jewish race," end quote. During the war, then, the Pope's tactic of measured condemnation inspired and encouraged the free world and angered and antagonized the Nazi totalitarians. That's a pretty eloquent silence, and it speaks volumes for the Church's moral authority. But did the tactic save lives? Wouldn't excommunication or something equally dramatic have put a stop to Nazism altogether? We can always wonder. Maybe a different policy would have done more, but Pius XII's policy did an awful lot. In 1967, the Israeli and Jewish historian and diplomat, Pinchas Lapid, published a meticulously researched and comprehensive book entitled Three Popes and the Jews. He gave empirical evidence that Pius XII's tactic of measured words and strenuous, constant, hidden action on the part of Catholics throughout Europe, who hid Jews in convents, monasteries, houses, churches, and episcopal palaces, quote, was instrumental in saving at least 700,000, but probably as many as 860,000 Jews from certain death at Nazi hands, end quote. Another historian, Stephen Crocker, used that estimate to do some math, pointing out that 8,300,000 European Jews were within the Nazi grasp during the war, and 6 million of them were killed, leaving 2,300,000 survivors. If Pius XII engineered 700,000 rescues, which is the conservative estimate, that means that he and the Catholic Church were actually responsible for saving 30% of the survivors. The Pope's accusers have never even tried to contradict those statistics. They just ignore them, saying that the Pope could have done more. Maybe he could have, but to his mind, at least if you believe the historical record, he did his best, and those 700,000 Jews were grateful for it. As a matter of fact, in the years immediately following the war, Jews all over the world officially and personally expressed their unqualified gratitude for all that Pius XII had done for them during the Holocaust. On the 10th anniversary of Italian liberation, the entire Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra flew to Rome to give a special concert in the Vatican in gratitude for the help Jews had received from the Pope and the Catholic Church. The first two Israeli prime ministers, Golda Meir and Moshe Sharrat, publicly praised him multiple times, and the chief rabbi of Rome, Isaac Herzog, did the same. In fact, so struck was he by the charity and wisdom of the Pope and the testimony of the Catholic Church that he eventually became a Catholic himself, and when he did, he chose the Christian name Eugenio, in honor of Eugenio Pacelli, Pope Pius XII. These and hundreds of other Jews who experienced the war and the Pope's policies firsthand are unanimous in their praise for his so-called silence and its magnificent results. All the critics are from the succeeding generation. Considering the overwhelming evidence in favor of the Pope, one might reasonably conclude that these critics have some other reason for wanting to discredit the Church, a reason that has little to do with historical truth or justice. Maybe they should take a cue from the famous Jewish scientist Albert Einstein, who had this to say about the Church, about justice, and about truth. Quote, "Being a lover of freedom, when the Nazi Revolution came in Germany, I looked to the universities to defend it, knowing that they had always boasted of their devotion to the cause of truth. But, no, the universities immediately were silenced. Then I looked to the great editors of the newspapers, whose flaming editorials in days gone by had proclaimed their love of freedom. But they, like the universities, were silenced in a few short weeks. Only the Catholic Church stood squarely across the path of Hitler's campaign for suppressing the truth. I never had any special interest in the Church before, but now I feel a great affection and admiration because the Church alone has had the courage and persistence to stand for intellectual truth and moral freedom. I am forced, thus, to confess that what I once despised, I now praise unreservedly." End quote. And that's some straight talk about Pius XII and the Holocaust.
Got questions about the Catholic Church? The Straight Talk series makes key Catholic issues easier to understand. These explanations aren't meant to be exhaustive treatments, but instead offer clear reference points for the Catholic perspective. Straight Talk about the Catholic Church.
You have been listening to The Catholic Perspective, a resource from rcspirituality.org. Please visit our website and check out more great resources to help you pray, learn, grow, and go. Please join our team of digital missionaries by subscribing at rcspirituality.org.